Hey everyone, welcome back to Rebekah's Reading Corner. As you can see, I've got a little bit of a different setup going on today. I just moved back home from college for the summer, and I'm still kind of figuring out what setup in here is going to look the best. But I wanted to go ahead and share my thoughts on the latest book that I read, which is Eileen by Otessa Moshfegh. I hope I pronounced that right. This will be a bit of a shorter video today than the last one, just because there's not quite as much to cover as far as world building and plot and characters, but I do want to go ahead and share my thoughts on this story. This book is something. The themes that it presents and the ideas are fascinating and good to think about, but I don't really think that I like the execution as far as how it was integrated into the plot, and I feel like the plot was kind of lacking in substance. At times it felt more like I was reading a philosophical piece than an actual story. Which, there's nothing wrong with writing philosophical pieces, but the back of the book, the summary and the reviews all led me to believe that it was some, like, thrilling, dark. The summary and the reviews all had me thinking it was some tense, dark, thrilling story that was going to keep me on the edge of my seat the whole time. And if I'm being honest, it really wasn't. And especially because I feel like the story doesn't really pick up until almost 200 pages in. And this book is only like 260 pages. So you get like way more than half through the book before it picks up and things start happening. But my main complaint is with the character of Eileen. Now, I know it's good to keep your character flaws, and having flawed characters makes for really interesting storytelling. However, in this instance, there is nothing that I like about this protagonist. There's nothing that makes me root for her, and there's nothing that makes me feel really any kind of empathy for her. She's got a lot of internalized misogyny and homophobia, and she's so incredibly angsty and self-centered, not to mention the fact that she's a pervert and a stalker from the get-go. She stalks this guy from her work named Randy, drives around his house trying to get a peek in his windows. It's very creepy. And she has this attitude of simultaneously thinking that she is like the dirt of the earth, and also that she's so much better than everyone because she hides her perversions and evil thoughts behind a death mask. And it's like this attitude of, I am the only one that could possibly be having these problems. No one else understands me. Everyone else's life is perfect except for mine. And it just drags on and on for like 100 or so pages of just her talking about how awful her life is and how miserable she is. So when she complains about her life, I don't really feel bad for her. And maybe that's what the author was going for, that we just don't like the protagonist, but I'm not quite so sure with how it was written, if that was the intention. The story is told through the perspective of her as an elderly woman, recounting the events of when she was younger, and we get a lot of comments here and there talking about how she's a better person now, like she's able to love people, she's more connected with her emotions, and she is less self-centered and obsessed with her appearance, which we see a lot when she's younger. So we know that she has changed, by the point that she's the narrator, but we don't see that change happen throughout the story. I feel like by the end of what's being told here, she doesn't really change a whole lot, and the only real thing that changes is her attitude gets a little more positive towards the end, but there's still a lot of self-deprecation and woe is me throughout the entire book, and it makes her kind of an insufferable character, if I'm being totally honest. Now, to be fair, her life does kind of suck. I mean, she lives with her alcoholic father after her mom passed away, and she's basically his caretaker because he's losing his mind, and talking about hoodlums and demons, and their house is in utter disarray, and she works at this boys' correctional prison, and the prison is kind of like an awful place, at least for, you know, the boys that are being kept there. So her life does kind of suck, but she has this attitude of like, her life is the only one that sucks, that really just makes it hard to empathize with her. Now, as far as the plot goes for this book, there's not a whole lot that happens. I mean, we start out, she lives with her dad, she goes to the prison for work, she comes home, sometimes she goes to the liquor store to get her dad booze, and it just kind of repeats, and she has a different angsty inner dialogue each day, and this kind of just goes on and on until we meet another character named Rebekah, who is a new hire at the prison. Immediately, Eileen is smitten with Rebekah, and she admires her body in quite detail, and is like ecstatic that Rebekah remembers her name and is so enamored with her and thinks that she's such a perfect, beautiful woman, and then insists that she's not gay. Eileen's not gay, y'all. But she says things like, "Meeting Rebekah was like learning to dance, discovering jazz. It was like falling in love for the first time. I had always been waiting for my future to erupt around me in an avalanche of glory, and now I felt it was really happening. Rebekah was all it took." Now, no offense, Eileen, but I don't think that's very heterosexual of you. And I mean, let's be real, there's nothing wrong with if Eileen was a gay character, but it's just the fact that she denies it so openly and insists that she's not gay, but then talks about how in love she was with Rebekah. I don't know if that was supposed to be ironic on the author's part or not, but Eileen, you have a lot of self-discovery to do in that area. Anyways, after Rebekah comes to the prison, she becomes interested in this boy there called Lee Polk, who murdered his father, and Rebekah is really interested in what happened to this family, but Eileen doesn't really seem to care. She's just interested in the fact that she now has a friend and thinks that Rebekah is so beautiful, so like how would she ever want to hang out with Eileen? And she's more focused on her obsession with Rebekah than the mystery that's unfolding. And so later Rebekah invites her over for like Christmas Eve dinner. She shows up to the house and it's not what she expected. She expected Rebekah to be rich and elegant, and the house is like downtrodden and dirty, and Rebekah seems really off and tense, and so it's really awkward. And Eileen's about to leave because she can't handle the discomfort, when Rebekah reveals that she has Lee Polk's mother tied up in the basement. This is not Rebekah's house, that it is the Polk house. And this is where we find out that Lee Polk's father has been molesting him every single night, basically. And that's what drove him to kill his father. And the mom was complicit in it, and even aiding in it by giving her son some enema every night before bed, or enema. And then they go through this whole interrogation. Eileen now has her father's gun in the scene. Her father is a police officer, and his gun got relinquished to her because he couldn't be trusted with it anymore. So she has his gun on her now, and she threatens Mrs. Polk with this gun. There's this moment where Rebekah leaves to go get some paper to write down the confession, and Mrs. Polk just reveals everything to Eileen while Rebekah's gone. And then when Rebekah comes back, she refuses to speak again and is tired and is like, just kill me. And Rebekah gets frustrated and takes the gun from Eileen and accidentally shoots Mrs. Polk in the arm. So now the girls are panicking and they need to figure out what to do. Eileen comes up with a plan to frame her father for the murder and have the two women escape to New York. But none of that really happens. She says goodnight to her father. She tucks him into bed in a drunken stupor. She takes her money and leaves with Mrs. Polk still in the truck. And she doesn't wait for Rebekah because she knows that Rebekah has already run off and abandoned her. And so she drives off to some abandoned road. She leaves Mrs. Polk in the car to die, and then catches a ride to New York. So yeah, that could have been more interesting if it was a little more fleshed out, if it was a little earlier in the plot. I mean, it takes like a whopping 220 pages before we actually get to all of that stuff with the Christmas Eve dinner and Mrs. Polk tied up in the basement. And so we literally just have like 40 pages for all of that stuff to happen, when the previous like 220 pages were just talking about Eileen's life at home and at work. I mean, it was definitely a slow burn of a book. And I just wish we would have had more of what we had at the end. Like, at least make it longer, the bit at the end, if you're not going to put it earlier in the story. I just feel like we spent a lot of time diving into the mundane stuff, which is good stuff, don't get me wrong, but I just feel like the really interesting and really thrilling stuff was barely even touched on. So I'm a little disappointed, especially because like the back of the book made it sound so much more interesting, especially in like the language it used, like how it says, in a Hitchcockian twist, her affection for Rebekah ultimately pulls her into complicity in a crime that surpasses her wildest imaginings. Now, that to me made it sound like it was going to be something bigger than just having a woman tied up in a basement and, you know, leaving her to bleed out in your truck. But, you know, it is what it is, I guess. This book does touch on some good topics like womanhood and female friendships and mental health, but I feel like the conclusion of it isn't super satisfying, and I feel like we could have had more development on how this character's perspective changes without having to interject from the narrator, like, oh, I don't believe this anymore, I'm changed now. I really just wish we would have seen that progression a little bit further. There is a change of once she meets Rebekah, she starts to be more positive and think better about her circumstances, but we still don't really see her worldviews changing, and we know they change, so I just really would have liked to have seen a little bit more of that progression. Overall, I would say I'd probably give this book like 2.5 out of 5 stars. It personally was just a little slow. I mean, I highlighted a lot of stuff. There was a lot of interesting thoughts. It just doesn't really stand out to me as one that I would say is my favorite, one that I would recommend to someone off the top of my head, but I am kind of glad that I read it. Overall, those are my thoughts on Eileen. So those are my thoughts on Eileen. If you've read the book and you agree with me or disagree with me on my thoughts, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. And thank you for watching my video. I'll catch you guys next time.